This teaching is part 2 in our series, Hidden Stars, which is a Bible study based on the Book of Esther. And before we get started, I have a question for you. How many chapters are there in the Book of Esther? Most people would probably say about 6, because if you're rather familiar with the Bible, you might know that in chapter 4, Mordecai sends a message to Esther. Perhaps you've been called to your position for such a time as this. But we seem to think that the story kind of goes like, and then Esther confronts the king. They confront Haman, who's the enemy.
The king, he cancels the verdict. The plot was against the Jews. They all celebrate, and the book ends about chapter 6.
But that's not how it goes. There are actually 10 chapters in the Book of Esther. And from chapters 4 to 10, we get a lot of details about our next hidden star, which is Mordecai, Esther's cousin guardian. If you missed part 1, we discussed the background of the book, main and supporting characters, and 8 lessons that we can learn from Esther. One of my favorites is that Esther had conviction. That's what allowed her to say, if I perish, I perish. Mordecai is not only hidden in several times throughout the Book of Esther, but he seems hidden to us. It's like we often miss what God was doing in and through him. But I just want to mention briefly 2 times that I feel like he was hidden in the book. It seems like often people did not even notice Mordecai. Number 1, when Esther was taken into the harem, the Bible says that he walked by the gate daily to see and asked about how she was doing. If anyone would have made the connection between Mordecai and Esther, they might have realized that she was of Jewish background. Number 2, one time Mordecai is once again by the gate.
Oh, was he in the gate or the garden?
In another occasion, Mordecai is sitting by the king's gate and he overhears a plot of 2 of the guards to assassinate the king. Did they really not realize he was there? You just have this conversation out in the open. They're the king's guards, they should have known better. But once again, Mordecai is hidden. It's like he goes unseen. Mordecai is not seen when he does a good deed. When he tells of the plot, he gets no immediate reward. We're going to talk about the reward, but it's like no one noticed him then. To me, Mordecai represents like an underdog or those people who work behind the scenes. He is not the star of the book by any means, but he is a star in his own right, and he surely shines in the dark. And isn't that what a star does? Shine in the dark. For me also, I can really relate to Mordecai when I feel like I'm in a losing season. Like maybe you feel like I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. I'm doing what's right, but it just seems like I can't get a break. Like it's just not working out for me. And not that Mordecai ever complains by any means. That's just the kind of guy he was, a man full of integrity. Let's go into more details about the first plot that we hear about in the Book of Esther. So the time where there was a plot to assassinate the king, I briefly mentioned what happened. What I find interesting, it tells us that right after Mordecai sent news to Esther so that she can make the news known, the king honors Haman. And no, I didn't mistake the names. It's like, specifically it says, right after this, the king honored Haman. Mordecai is the one who saved the life of the king. Imagine if a really wealthy person, if you found their phone, everything that's in their phone, and you returned it, and they gave you no reward. Imagine that you saved the life of a really important person, and it just seems to go unnoticed. But that's one of the things that we learn about God, that man may not reward us. Man may forget about us, but there's some things that God is going to take care to reward us in due season. The Bible tells us, do not become weary of doing good, for in due season you will reap a harvest. And it tells us, if we do not dismay, we cannot become tired of doing good. I look at Mordecai and I think, he raised Esther. What reward did he get for that? The matter was found to be true, the plot against the king. And it says it was recorded in the book of the annals of the king, like the king's chronicles, in the presence of the king. So it's not that the king didn't know. That's what I just love so much about what God was doing in and through Mordecai. Because there's these times where it's like, really? No one is going to notice like what just happened here? And they knew it just wasn't time. Remember, time is such a key word throughout the Book of Esther. Your time will come to be recognized. But be careful, because I feel like we live in a very credit sensitive world. Even that you got to do like photo credit, like who took this picture? Let's give photo credit. And I mean, I understand you're a photographer, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing. But haven't you noticed that we are people who desire to have credit for everything that we do? when it comes to doing what's right, God sees. God sees, God knows, God rewards. This whole incident reminds me of what happened to Joseph. Because when Joseph was in the prison, again, for doing nothing wrong, he continued to do what was right and serve others. When there were two people, the baker and the cupbearer, who had dreams, Joseph said, "Oh, tell me about your dreams." Joseph interpreted the dreams, and just like he interpreted, the cupbearer got out of prison and was restored to his position. Joseph specifically said, "Hey, don't forget about me when you're restored." Well, that's exactly what happened. 2 years passed, and there was no mention of Joseph by the cupbearer to the king. But the time came. The time came where the king had a dream, and the cupbearer remembers. And I say remembers because is it really that the cupbearer remembered, or is that God is involved so much in the dealings of our life that, again, things that happen and we didn't do anything wrong and we did what was right and we didn't get any credit, we didn't get any recognition. Matter of fact, somebody else might have gotten credit for what you did. But it says they called Joseph immediately, and just like that, boom, they took him out of prison, dressed him, and there he was standing in the presence of the Pharaoh. And we're going to see the same thing happen in the life of Mordecai. When your time comes, you will be called. David was called out of a field when he wasn't even invited to the table. At the appointed time, Mordecai was going to be rewarded in only a way that God can. We're going to just pause here to discuss another plot in the Book of Esther. So there's two major plots that we see unfold, and the second plot is against the people of God, specifically the Jews that are in exile in the Persian territory. In the first part of the series, we mentioned that there were 127 provinces that were under the reign of King Xerxes, and there is a decree that goes out to annihilate all of the Jewish people throughout all of the provinces in the kingdom of King Xerxes. How did this happen? Well, it kind of all started with Mordecai. So Haman, we know, represents the enemy. He's the bad guy. And it says that all the people would bow before Haman as he would walk through because he was the second highest official after the king. But Mordecai would not bow. Mordecai was a man of integrity, of conviction, who held on to his principles, and he is not to bow or give worship, adoration to anybody else. So he refuses to bow. And interestingly, people, they keep asking him, "Mordecai, why aren't you bowing? Mordecai, why aren't you bowing?" And people, they start making a big deal until they finally make sure that Haman knows Mordecai is not bowing to you. As a side note, just bonus material, do you recall when Jesus was tempted in the desert, the devil said, "I will give you all this if you only bow down to me"? So just, I'll let you make that connection between the devil and Haman. If you don't know too much about Haman's background, it says that he's an Agagite. And if you look up to see what's the history of an Agagite, it says that he's a descendant of Agag. The history of Haman and his ancestors goes all the way back to when Saul was king. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, I'm going to give you a little bit of the background. It tells us in verse 2, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt." Verse 3 says, "Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy." You hear that? Totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare their livestock, anything. Verse 8 then says, "He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword." So King Agag then becomes the only person left of all of the Amalekites. Well, to now have someone who says, "I'm an Agagite," is a descendant of King Agag. Saul disobeyed, and now we see the outcome. It's really no wonder why Haman, when he finds out of Mordecai's background, decides, "I don't need to just destroy Mordecai. I need to destroy all of the Jews that are in these provinces." In Esther 3:6, it says they cast lots to see what day the Jews will be destroyed. And if you read it specifically in the New Living Translation, we find out that the date chosen was March 7th. I find this an interesting detail. And Esther 3:7, which is, like March 7, tells us that the date chosen was March 7th. But I just want you to have that little piece of information that there was a date assigned for destruction of God's people. But what the enemy meant for evil, God used it for good. And it's not just something we say, but it's something that we see in the story of Esther. When Mordecai heard about this news, it says he put on sackcloth and he went wailing, crying throughout the city. He humbled himself. And there is a major lesson that we learn from the life of Mordecai, which is before honor is humility, which means before you're honored by God, before God puts you in honor amongst men, you have to humble yourself before God. We have to submit before God. If my people would only, first thing, humble themselves. Before we pray, before we fast, before we do anything, we have to humble ourselves. We have to put ourselves in our right position, which is low before God, and call out to him. That's what Mordecai did. He did not have any reservation at all about going before God. He knew where his solution was. One benefit of humility is not only for us to be exalted, but to see God's hand work in our favor. Humble yourselves before the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you in due season. I mean, this is exactly what we're seeing. Mordecai is in sackcloth. He is crying. He is seeking the Lord. He is crying out for mercy, not just for himself, but for all of his people. That's when Mordecai goes and persuades Esther that she needs to do something. Plot twist. Who doesn't love a good plot twist? So, please, stick with me on this, because this is where the story gets so good that only God could have done something like this. And I think I'm too excited, so I'm going to have to read some of my notes here. Okay, so in chapter 6 of Esther, Haman, he sets up a poll because he's like, you know what? I got to kill Mordecai. That's it. He won't bow to me. I'm going to destroy all the Jews. He's evil. And he sets up a poll to destroy Mordecai, to hang him. And I wanted to make sure I get the detail correctly. It says, the night that Haman set up the poll, the very night that Haman set up the poll, that same night, one particular night, the king could not sleep. And when the king could not sleep, he decided that he wanted to have some of the records, the annals that we talked about, or chronicles, read to him. And as they're going over the chronicles, he hears about a plot, remember the plot, that they wanted to kill him. And the king asks a question, what has been done for Mordecai? As soon as he asked that question, what has been done? Guess who walks in the door? Guess. You know it, right? Who else is going to walk in the door but Haman? Now, Haman didn't hear the name Mordecai. So the king asked Haman. He's like, what should be done? The king is like, oh, so glad you're here. Listen, I need some advice. What should be done for a man that the king wants to honor? What should be done for a man that delights the king? Of course, Haman, thinking that it's himself, right? Because the king didn't say any names. He's like, oh, this is what you should do. Hold on. Let me go get my Bible. Okay. I really want to read those verses because, this is what the king is going to ultimately do this is what the king is ultimately going to do for Mordecai. This is Haman's response. This is his suggestion of what the king should do for a man who the king wants to honor. For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim this, thus shall it be done for the man that the king delights to honor. So, if you know the story, you know why this is so ironic already. So then, the king is like, Haman, love your idea. Take it. And guess what? Do everything that you just said. Don't leave anything out for Mordecai. Wait, what? Yup. For Mordecai. Haman walked in, ready to tell the king about his plans to kill Mordecai. and he walks out, that he is the one who has to parade Mordecai around. But do you see what is being done for Mordecai when he humbled himself before God? God chose to honor him. God chose to exalt him. And he used his own enemy. You set a table before me in the presence of my enemies. We can read, humble yourself before the mighty hand of God so he can exalt you in due season. We can read about how we will reap what we sow. And obviously a good thing, right? When we do good things. But it takes time. And it feels like, no, that's other people. That's not me. But it's the same God. And he sees. He knows. How is Haman going to explain the king now that he has a plan to kill Mordecai? Obviously not. So let me read you this one proverb which we are seeing exemplified in the book of Esther. Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction. So before there's destruction, there was pride. A haughty spirit before a fall. Pride comes before a fall. Proverbs 18:12 says, before a downfall, the heart is haughty. There's not just a fall for no reason. There was pride in the heart of man. I heard once someone say, pride is at the root of every sin. But humility comes before honor. There is humility before honor. We see it all unfolding rather quickly in the book of Esther, but in our lives, things tend to take time. But just know, do the right thing and let God be the one who reveals truth. So let me speed it up a little bit because we still have a few chapters. And like I told you, there's a lot of details of what God is doing in and through Mordecai. Before we get to chapter 8, there's a lot of interesting things that happen in chapter 7, which I just want to try to go over quickly. Even something that I just find like a funny detail. It says that Haman was reclining where Esther was sitting, like he was reclining, and then he started falling. The king was like, what? And you're trying to get on my woman too? That's it. So God will take care of the details. I don't know. I hope you see what I'm seeing. Esther 7:10, we see the enemy fell into his own trap. The king is like, that's it. Haman, you're trying to destroy Esther's people. You tried to kill Mordecai. You know what? Let's hang Haman. And the same trap that Haman set up, he fell into his own trap. The decree could not just be erased. The king explained, if there's a decree out there, I can't just erase it. But what I will do is allow you to create a new decree. See, there was a decree that was against us. Christ, he eliminated that decree. But as we're reading here in the book of Esther, the decree that was written, no one could erase it. So this is what happens in Esther chapter 8. The king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman. He gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. This is amazing. Then the king tells them, you yourselves write a new decree, as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the ring, no one can evoke. And verse 15, guys, you got to see this verse. Remember, this is all about Mordecai as the hidden star. Verse 15 says, so Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. In one chapter, right, let's say of Mordecai's life, even in the book of Esther, we see Mordecai dressed in sackcloth, covered in ashes, bowed down and crying out to God. Complete surrender, humility. Then we see Mordecai dressed, riding on the king's horse. And I see this as a foreshadowing of what was to come. And this is the moment that was to come. Because it was nice, right? When Mordecai was acknowledged and he was dressed and paraded around and honored, but the decree was still out there. And knowing Mordecai, he was just like, okay, Lord, this is just a sign that you're doing something. You ever just feel like, okay, Lord, I just need to know that I'm on the right path. I need to know that you're hearing me, that you're going to do something, Lord. Just give me a sign, right? And that was a sign that your own enemy paraded you around honoring you. But now we see Mordecai dressed with the king's ring over the house of his enemy. There's so many Bible verses that I can think of to support what's happening. But let's just try to get to the end of the story, right? Esther 9 verse 4, because this is all about Mordecai today. It says, "For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces." That's a lot of provinces. "For this man, Mordecai, became increasingly prominent. Thus, the Jews defeated all of their enemies because the new decree stated that the Jews had the right to defend themselves. And when they began to defend themselves, they defeated anyone who was coming against them." If you have not read through the Book of Esther, please do so. Especially if you're feeling like you're in a losing season and you feel like God's not hearing you. We're going to get to part 3. There's one more part of this study. So I invite you to stay connected so that you can hear what we're going to talk about in the last series of Hidden Stars, right? Our Bible study of the Book of Esther. Here are some takeaways that I've gotten from the life of Mordecai, of what God did in him and what God did through him. Number 1, have integrity. Do what is right. Be the same whether someone's looking or someone is not looking. Don't worry about receiving credit, getting applause, or getting rewarded. Let God take care of what God needs to take care of. Let God do with your enemies as God needs to do. That leads me to the next takeaway. Vengeance and rewards belong to the Lord. I see this in a very powerful way. There is power in humility. It seems totally opposite, right? But isn't that what being a hidden star is all about, right? It's just opposites. How can there be power in humility? Humility seems like, as we use it in culture, like you humiliated me. It's like to say you embarrassed me. But really, humiliation is something that we should do to ourselves. I know in Spanish we say, "Yo no voy a dejar que nadie me humille." You know, like I'm not going to let anybody put me down. This isn't about letting someone take advantage of you or abusing you. This is about your position before God. Another lesson that I'm taking from the life of Mordecai is that a losing season does not last forever. I hope you're enjoying this series so far. And like I said, I really encourage you to read through some of these chapters and verses. So if you think you know who is going to be our last and hidden star in the Book of Esther, leave it in the comments below. Let me know what you think. And I hope you keep coming back to the well for more teachings, more encouragement. And God bless you. I'll see you guys soon.